Okay, let's just get right into it. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at a massive, frankly unprecedented shift happening right now in the world of artificial intelligence. We're moving away from an era where we just simply consume AI as passive observers and stepping into an era where we actively build it. So if you've been sitting on the sidelines watching the open source AI space completely explode and you're wondering how to actually get involved, well, this explainer is exactly what you need.
To really grasp why this matters today, I want you to think about this number, 39%. According to Hugging Face's 2026 Spring Report, independent and unaffiliated developers now account for a massive 39% of all model downloads. That is a huge slice of the pie. It basically means the power is shifting away from centralized megacorporations and falling right into the hands of the community. You're no longer just a user, the ecosystem literally needs you as a builder.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the rise of independent AI builders, walk through the four-phase contribution path, explore software versus hardware, navigate the open-source licensing maze, and finally, wrap up with the ultimate career payoff. All right, Section 1, the rise of independent AI builders, the new era of development. The current AI landscape is actually mirroring a major historical shift.
The folks behind the Autonomous Computer open source project hit the nail on the head. They pointed out that AI in 2026 looks a whole lot like computing back in 1975. Back then, intelligence lived in these massive mainframes owned by a few companies, and you just sort of rented time on them. But then computing moved to the personal desk. We're seeing that exact same decentralization today with local AI. Before 2022, the industry's share of model downloads was hovering around 70%, but by 2026, that industry share plummeted to 37%, while independent devs surged to 39%. Individuals are taking the wheel here.
Which brings us to Section 2, the four-phase contribution path, a blueprint for trust. So if you want to join that 39%, how do you actually get started?
You'd probably think the very first step is to sit down and write some brilliant algorithm, right? Well, Mahmoud Mabrouk from the dev community has some fantastic advice here. Don't jump straight into code. It sounds totally counterintuitive, I know, but the absolute secret to contributing to major AI projects is that your first job is simply to prove you can follow the rules and integrate with the community.
There's actually a super specific timeline you can follow for this. In week 1, your only goal is to build trust. Jump into their Discord, fix a typo in the docs, or just help someone reproduce a bug. It's a low-stakes pull request that basically proves to maintainers that you respect their process. Then, in weeks 2 and 3, you will learn the codebase. Actually use the software, run the test suites, study merged PR so you understand the style patterns the maintainers prefer. By weeks 3 and 4, you're ready for your first code contribution. Find a good first issue. Talk about your approach in the thread before you write a single line, and keep your changes under 200 lines. No surprises, right? Finally, you move into regular contribution where you specialize. Maybe you become, say, the evaluation metrics person for that entire project.
Let's pivot to Section 3, software, hardware, and beyond, choosing your weapon. Because getting involved isn't just about tweaking LLM training scripts anymore.
You've got some really distinct paths here based on what you're into. On the software side, you could contribute to agentic frameworks. Think about projects like LangChain or specialized local coding models like Devstral, where you're literally shaping how AI agents interact with toolbases. But then, on the flip side, we've got hardware. You can contribute to the open infrastructure required to run these models locally, like the Autonomous Computer project, where the end goal is essentially building your own personal AI data center.
And it's wild to think about what an AI contribution actually looks like today. For open hardware projects, sharing 3D CAD files for a server bracket, optimizing a bill of materials, sharing multi-GPU BIOS tuning settings, or even just improving assembly docs. Those are incredibly valuable, fully recognized open-source contributions. You are quite literally building the physical shell that holds the intelligence.
Moving on to Section 4, the open source licensing maze, rules of the realm. Look, before you pour your heart and soul into a project, you've got to understand what open source actually means legally in the AI space today.
Let's look at the official standard. The Open Source Initiative recently defined true open source AI with the OSAID 1.0 standard, which heavily emphasizes the freedom to study and modify the system. To be open source, a project has to release the code, the weights, and the data information. Now, to be completely objective here, this definition is the subject of some pretty intense industry debate. The OSI requires detailed information about the data so a skilled person could recreate the system, while critics, like the Free Software Foundation, argue that without the raw datasets themselves, you can't meaningfully modify anything. But regardless of where you stand on the debate, this is currently the benchmark for what constitutes true open-source AI.
This leads us right into the real-world licenses you're going to run into. On one side, we have classic OSS like Apache 2.0 and MIT. These are legally safe, permissive, standard licenses that everyone understands. On the other side, we have custom licenses, what we usually call open-weight models, like Meta's Llama or Google's Gemma. And make no mistake, these are not standard open-source licenses. They act way more like restrictive contracts with dynamic, conditional rules.
When you compare them side by side, the dangers of those custom licenses become incredibly clear. Under Apache 2.0, you've got no restrictions, no scale thresholds, and explicit patent protection. It's an irrevocable grant of freedom. It's the gold standard. But under Llama 3, Meta imposes a competitor ban, training bans, and a scale threshold where, if your app happens to hit 700 million monthly active users, your license converts to Meta's sole discretion. Yikes! Meanwhile, Gemma's terms of use require a flow-down obligation, which means you legally have to force Google's prohibited use policies onto all of your end users. These custom licenses just don't offer the freedom of Apache. They create a complicated legal relationship that you have to constantly manage.
So, with all that technical and legal groundwork laid out, we have to ask the million-dollar question. You've mastered the code, you've navigated the licenses, but what is the actual reward for this quest? Why go through all this trouble?
And that brings us to our final section, the ultimate career payoff, outshining the competition. This is all about how you stand out in an incredibly crowded machine learning job market.
There's a stark contrast here when it comes to proving your skills. A standard dev portfolio is usually packed with, weather apps and to-do lists, and hey, that shows you can follow a tutorial. But an open source portfolio, that's a pure demonstration of skill. Imagine walking into an interview and casually mentioning you fixed critical bugs in Llama Index, or you wrote evaluation metrics for DeepEval. You're proving, without a doubt, that you can ship features used by thousands of people in real-world production environments. The value there is just undeniable.
We like to call this the confidence effect. There is this massive, unbridgeable gap between coding alone in a vacuum and creating real, tangible value alongside senior engineers in a major project. Plus, it brings a massive network effect. When you're consistently contributing, the project maintainers notice you. And guess what? Those maintainers work at top AI companies. They're exactly the people who can act as direct referrals for roles within their own organizations.
And if you need proof, just look at this. 4 months. The dev community recently documented a real-world case study of a developer who started their journey just by fixing some simple documentation on an AI project. By consistently sticking to that 4-phase path we talked about, they gained the maintainer's trust, leveled up to regular code contributor, and literally received a junior ML engineer job offer in exactly 4 months. That is the kind of leverage open source provides.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. The ecosystem has shifted. The tools, the models, the hardware, it's all out there, just waiting for you to contribute. So, are you going to keep renting someone else's intelligence by the token, or are you ready to build your own? The path is laid out right in front of you. Go find a project, jump into their Discord, fix some documentation, and start building. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will see you in the next one.